Chapter 1. Introduction. Why Spartacus is still fascinating today. Spartacus. Hardly any other name from antiquity has burned itself into the collective memory as strongly as his. He was not an emperor, not a senator, not a famous orator or philosopher, but a slave, a gladiator, a man without rights. And yet he became a symbol of freedom, resistance, and rebellion against oppression. The uprising, which he led together with thousands of prisoners and disenfranchised people against the powerful Roman Republic, is still considered one of the largest and most dramatic slave uprisings in history. What makes Spartacus so special? On the one hand, the sheer size of the uprising. While there were always minor revolts in antiquity, the Third Slave War was of a dimension that terrified Rome. Hundreds of thousands of slaves and allies joined Spartacus, repeatedly defeated Roman legions, and kept Italy in suspense for years. On the other hand, it was the personality of Spartacus that fascinated posterity. Ancient sources describe him as clever, brave, and just, qualities that go far beyond the cliché of a brutal insurgent. The Spartacus uprising is at the same time a mirror of Roman society. It shows how much the Roman economy and politics rested on the backs of the slaves, and how deep the social tensions within the Republic were. While Rome expanded outwards and amassed wealth, countless people suffered from exploitation, poverty, and deprivation of rights. Spartacus's struggle was thus not only an uprising of the slaves, but also a symptom of Rome's internal crisis. Until modern times, Spartacus was reinterpreted again and again. For some, he was a freedom fighter, a forerunner of modern revolutionaries. For others, he was a dangerous rebel, a symbol of the threat to order. His story has been told many times in literature, art, and film, from ancient historians to Hollywood. This script will shed light on the history of Spartacus in all its facets, his origins, the conditions of slavery in Rome, the escape from the gladiator school of Capua, the battles against the Roman legions, the great victories, and the final defeat. We will see how a single man rose from the mass of the disenfranchised and for a short time challenged the most powerful republic of antiquity, and how his legacy continues to have an impact today. Chapter 2. The Roman Republic and the World of Slaves. To understand the Spartacus uprising, one must look at the social order and economic foundations of the Roman Republic. For Spartacus's story is inextricably linked to the fate of the millions of people who lived in servitude in Rome. Without slavery, neither the uprising nor the panic it triggered in Rome would have been conceivable. In the 1st century BC, Rome was at the height of its power. The Republic had conquered large parts of the Mediterranean. Spain, Greece, parts of Asia, and North Africa were under Roman control. Each of these conquests brought not only riches, but also prisoners to Italy, and these captives were made slaves. In some years, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people flocked to the Roman markets: men, women, children, entire families. Slaves were the invisible basis of the Roman economy. They worked on the large latifundia, the estates of rich senators, where they cultivated fields, harvested wine and olives, or tended cattle. They toiled in mines, in workshops, and households. Some served as teachers or doctors if they came from educated regions such as Greece. Others were forced into the most cruel work, in quarries or on galleys. The life of a slave depended on his function. House slaves could lead a comparatively bearable existence, sometimes even develop a close relationship with their masters. Field slaves, on the other hand, lived in inhumane conditions, exploited to the point of complete exhaustion. Legally, slaves had no protection. They were property, not persons. A master could sell them, punish them, abuse them, or even kill them without having to fear consequences. As the number of slaves grew, so did tensions. Revolts occurred again and again, especially where conditions were the hardest. The two great slave revolts in Sicily in the years 135 to 132 BC and 104 to 100 BC already showed that the Roman order was vulnerable. Thousands of slaves had risen up, conquered cities, and defeated Roman troops before they were finally defeated. But Rome learned little from these experiences. Instead of eliminating the causes, the dependence on slave labor and the cruel conditions, they reacted with ever tougher controls. Gladiator schools like the one in Capua were built to train prisoners to fight in the arenas. For the Roman population, these games were entertainment. For the prisoners, they were a death sentence. In this world, in which people were degraded to commodities and violence determined everyday life, Spartacus's importance grew. The uprising he led was not an accidental explosion of violence, but the consequence of a society that systematically disenfranchised millions of people. It was the expression of the cry for freedom that was suppressed in the mines, in the fields, and in the arenas of Rome. Chapter 3. Spartacus, Origin, Youth, and the Way to the Gladiator School. We know little about Spartacus's life before the Great Uprising. The ancient sources are sparse, often contradictory, and they were written almost exclusively by Roman historians, i.e., by those who regarded him as an enemy. Nevertheless, outlines of his life can be seen that offer enough room for fascination, but also for legends. Spartacus probably came from Thrace, a region in present-day Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. In the eyes of the Romans, the Thracians were considered wild, warlike people who were known for their bravery, but also for their independence. Many Thracian tribes fought both against and for Rome, depending on the political situation. Spartacus is said to have originally been a soldier, perhaps even as an auxiliary in Roman service. This would explain why he possessed military knowledge that would later be of great use to him in the uprising. How he ended up in slavery remains unclear. Some sources report that he deserted, was captured, and made a slave. Others suggest that he was simply deported to Rome as a prisoner of war. The only thing that is certain is that in the end, he found himself in the hands of Roman traders, who sold him not to a country estate or a mine, but to one of the toughest institutions of the time, the gladiator school of Capua. Capua was a center of gladiatorship. One of the largest and most brutal schools was located here, headed by Lentulus Batiatus. Men from all parts of the world, prisoners of war, convicted criminals, and slaves, were trained here to fight in the arenas. For the Romans, the gladiatorial games were a spectacle, an expression of power and entertainment. For the fighters, they were a life on the brink of death, day after day. Strict discipline prevailed at school. The men were trained with swords, spears, and nets. They learned different fighting styles, which were later displayed in the arenas. Everyday life consisted of drill, hunger, violence, and the constant reminder that her life was only of value as long as it entertained the audience. Spartacus, strong, intelligent, and full of a spirit of resistance, soon attracted attention among the gladiators. It was in this environment that he also met his closest comrades in arms, men like Crassus and Onamos, who would later become leaders in the uprising. Together, they endured the beatings of the instructors, the harassment of the guards, and the hunger for freedom that grew within them. The dream of overcoming the walls of the school and escaping fate grew stronger with each passing day. For Spartacus, the gladiator school was not a final stop, but the starting point of a revolt that was soon to shake the entire Roman Empire. What began as an individual fate, a man enslaved and put on display, was to turn into a collective outcry the likes of which Rome had never experienced before. Chapter 4. The Escape from Capua, the beginning of the rebellion. The spark that was to ignite the Spartacus uprising jumped over in Capua. The gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus was a prison with no way out for many of the fighters. Day after day, they were drilled, humiliated, and prepared for death, only to die in the amphitheater for the amusement of the audience. But resistance was brewing beneath the surface, and Spartacus was one of those willing to risk everything. In 73 BC, the plan to escape matured. About 200 gladiators conspired to leave the school and escape to freedom. The sources report that the uprising almost failed even before it began. Betrayal or carelessness led to the conspiracy being discovered. Most of the men were taken by surprise, but a small group of about 70 managed to escape, led by Spartacus, Crassus, and Onamos. With kitchen knives, skewers, and everything they could get their hands on, they stormed through the walls and streets of Capua. Their first target was a wagon full of gladiatorial weapons that happened to be nearby. Armed with swords, shields, and helmets, they were no longer desperate refugees, but a small, well-organized fighting force. From Capua, they fled southwards, to Vesuvius, the mighty volcano near Naples. The steep slopes offered shelter and an overview, an ideal retreat for a group that was outnumbered but shone with determination and experience. Here they gathered, organized supplies, and began to make plans. News of their outbreak spread rapidly. For slaves all over Italy, the news was like a spark of hope. Men who were already dead in the eyes of Rome had freed themselves and successfully defended themselves. More and more escapees, agricultural workers, and disenfranchised people flocked to Spartacus and his companions. A handful of gladiators quickly became a growing army. Rome initially reacted disparagingly. For the Roman Senate, the rebellion was nothing more than an uprising of a few escaped slaves, a problem that local troops were to quickly put down. But the Romans underestimated Spartacus at his comrades in arms. In several battles, the insurgents repelled Roman units, used the terrain advantages at Vesuvius, and surprised their opponents with unconventional tactics. Particularly famous was an episode in which Spartacus had his men lead down the steep slopes of Vesuvius with ropes made of vines in order to attack the Romans who were blocking the mountain from behind. The unexpected attack ended in a victory that boosted the morale of the slave army and shook its opponents. What began as a desperate outburst had now become an open rebellion. Spartacus had not only fought for his own freedom, but had also given the signal that Rome was vulnerable. From the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a war began that would shake the heart of the Roman Republic and immortalize Spartacus's name. Chapter 5. The uprising grows, from the bunch of escaped slaves to the army. After the first successes on Vesuvius, it was clear that Spartacus's uprising was more than just a local incident. The news of the victories spread like wildfire through Italy, and more slaves dared to flee from their masters to join the growing movement. Men, women, and even children poured into the rebel camps. Soon, Spartacus's troop no longer consisted only of gladiators, but of a colorful mixture of people who all had one thing in common: the desire for freedom. The number of fighters rose rapidly. A few dozen became hundreds. Hundreds became tens of thousands. The Roman sources vary in their information, but it is certain that Spartacus at times had a force of more than 70,000 people at his disposal. A bunch of escaped slaves had become a veritable army, an army that dared to take on the most powerful republic in the world at the time. The organization was a huge challenge. Spartacus had to arm, care for, and discipline men who had never before been part of an orderly army. Many had no military training at all. Others came from completely different cultures and languages. But Spartacus succeeded in bringing order to the chaos. His military knowledge, presumably from his time as a Thracian warrior or Roman auxiliary, made him a natural leader. In addition to Spartacus, other leaders also emerged, especially Crassus, a Gaul who had a large following among the Celtic slaves. Oenomamus, another gladiator, also played an important role in the early years. Under their leadership, the rebels began to organize themselves into groups that operated like units. Tactically, they relied on mobility and surprise. Without heavy equipment and without fixed supply lines, they could march faster than the Roman legions. They attacked in a targeted manner, using terrain and ambushes, and disappeared before the Romans could react. Particularly feared were their night raids, in which they stormed Roman camps and captured supplies. But the army did not only consist of fighters. In the entourage were also women, children, and the elderly, who were dragged along. This made the uprising a mass movement, but also vulnerable. Spartacus not only had to protect his people in battle, but also provide food and shelter. Looting became the basis of life, which in turn unsettled the population and further darkened the image of the rebels in Rome. The success and the growing number of followers made Spartacus a symbol. For the slaves, he was the liberator, the bearer of hope. For Rome, he was a threat that could no longer be ignored. The initial arrogance gave way to growing panic. A supposedly small uprising had turned into a war that called into question the foundation of Roman society. Thus began a new phase of the conflict. Spartacus no longer led a desperate band, but an army, and Rome had to realize that it had to face this enemy seriously. Chapter 6. First victories over Rome, the humiliation of the legions. The Roman Republic was used to dealing with uprisings and internal unrest. But most of them were smaller revolts led by local militias or poorly equipped opponents. That a group of escaped slaves could pose a serious danger seemed unthinkable to the Senate at first. Therefore, at the beginning, no regular legions were sent, but hastily assembled troops under inexperienced commanders. It was precisely this overestimation of itself that was to cost Rome dearly. The first larger troop sent against Spartacus was under the command of the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. He believed that he could easily encircle the rebels on Mount Vesuvius by blocking the exits of the mountain. But Spartacus already showed his genius here. He had his men weave rope ladders from vines and descend the steep slopes of the volcano at night. From there, they attacked the Romans surprisingly from behind and defeated them devastatingly. This victory was more than a military episode, it was a symbol. Rome was not invincible. Further victories followed. A second Roman force under the praetor Publius Varinius suffered an equally humiliating defeat. Spartacus and his men took them by surprise, captured important officers, and captured rich equipment. This was a decisive moment for the slave army. It no longer had only improvised weapons, but real Roman war equipment, shields, helmets, swords. This increased their fighting power and self-confidence enormously. The ancient sources report that Spartacus tried to discipline his army after these victories. He forbade unnecessary cruelty and tried to control looting. He did not want to lead a pure band of robbers, but an army that was taken seriously. Some historians interpret this as a sign that Spartacus had a larger plan, perhaps to flee across the Alps, perhaps even to build a permanent settlement area for the liberated. For Rome, however, the defeats were a shock. The elite began to realize that this was not an accidental gang, but a growing movement that could be dangerous to legions. The fact that slaves, people who were considered property in Roman society, defeated Roman soldiers in open battles was a humiliation that shook the foundations of self-image. Spartacus's victories were more than military successes. They were a message to the whole of Italy. Rome was vulnerable. Everywhere slaves began to dream of freedom. Many fled to the rebels, others stirred up fear among their masters. The Roman upper class began to understand that they were dealing with a war that threatened the heart of the Republic. Chapter 7. Goals and Divisions. What did Spartacus really want? With each victory, the army of the insurgents grew. Thousands flocked, not only slaves of estates and mines, but also shepherds, uprooted peasants, adventurers, and even freemen who saw Spartacus as an opportunity for wealth or revenge. The movement was colorfully mixed, united in the desire for freedom, but by no means unified in its goals. Here, a problem began to emerge that was to weaken the uprising again and again, the question of where it was supposed to lead. We can only speculate about Spartacus's personal goals since the sources do not provide any direct statements from him. Many historians assume that he simply wanted to flee to freedom. After defeating the Roman legions several times, the way to the north seemed open. The rebels could have crossed the Alps into Gaul or further into Thrace, regions where Rome had less power and they might have been able to build a new existence. In fact, the sources report that Spartacus led his army north several times. He apparently wanted to cross the Alps and lead his people back to their homeland. But here the inner conflict within the movement became apparent. Many of his companions, especially the Gaul Crassus and his followers, did not want to flee, but to continue fighting. For them, rebellion was more than just a path to freedom. They wanted revenge on Rome, wealth through plunder, and perhaps even the power to establish their own empire in Italy. These different goals led to tensions. Spartacus, who apparently had a strategic vision, saw the danger of permanently challenging Rome. His pragmatic solution was to flee, but his companions dreamed of victory over the Republic itself. More than once, this led to divisions. Crassus separated with part of the army and led his own campaigns, which brought success but also cost losses and finally his life. Discipline was also difficult to maintain within the main army. Many men wanted to plunder, drink wine, and loot instead of carrying out strategic marches. Spartacus had to intervene again and again to create order and keep the troops together. His leadership role consisted not only in military skill, but also in swearing in such a heterogeneous mass of people to a common goal, an almost impossible task. The divisions made it clear how difficult it was to turn a spontaneous revolt into a real revolution. Spartacus wanted freedom, many wanted war. Spartacus wanted to escape, many wanted revenge. Rome was able to take advantage of this disunity, but until then, the slave army was to achieve further victories, victories that once again humiliated their opponents and nourished the dream of a permanent threat to Rome. Chapter 8. The Climax of the Rebellion. Spartacus' Greatest Successes. After the first surprising victories and internal divisions, the revolt reached its peak in 73 and 72 BC. Spartacus led a force that, according to ancient sources, at times comprised up to 100,000 people, men, women, and children, united in the dream of freedom. While these figures may be exaggerated, one thing is certain: never before had an army of slaves reached such strength, and never again should Rome be so shaken by such a movement. Spartacus made clever use of this mass. He led his men in rapid marches throughout Italy, repeatedly defeating Roman legions and skillfully avoiding larger encirclements. His goal was apparently to destabilize Rome and at the same time keep open an alternative to the north. In 72 BC, the greatest successes of the revolt occurred. Two Roman consuls, Gellius Coblicola and Lentulus Clodianus, opposed Spartacus with regular legions. For the Senate, this was the decisive attempt to finally put down the uprising. But Spartacus once again showed his military genius. In several battles, he succeeded in defeating the legions and plundering their camps. Entire units were destroyed or put to flight. These victories were of enormous symbolic power. They were no longer hastily thrown together militias that had been defeated by Spartacus, but regular legions of the Republic. Rome was embarrassed, and the fear of the rebels grew. Many cities began to strengthen their walls, and the Roman elite feared that Spartacus could march directly on Rome. Whether Spartacus actually planned this step remains unclear. Some sources suggest that he considered attacking the capital directly, but then decided against it. He probably knew that an attack on the best fortified and most populous city of antiquity could hardly succeed. Instead, he turned north again, perhaps to escape over the Alps after all. However, the movement remained torn. Crassus, the Gaul, separated with a large part of the army and fought his own battles. He eventually suffered a defeat at the hands of the Romans and was killed in battle. His death was a heavy blow, not only militarily, but also for morale. Spartacus honored his companion with a huge funeral ritual that could also be understood as a threat to Rome. Roman prisoners were forced to fight each other like gladiators, a mirror of the cruelty that the rebels themselves had suffered. Despite such setbacks, Spartacus's army remained strong and dangerous for years. He roamed Italy, devastated estates, plundered supplies, and repeatedly escaped Roman encirclement attempts. For many slaves, this was the first and only opportunity to rise up against their masters, and Spartacus embodied the hope that this struggle could lead them to freedom. But the bigger the uprising became, the bigger the problems became. Supplying such a mass was enormously difficult. Looting led to tensions with the rural population, and the question arose again and again: what was the actual goal? A new state? Fleeing across the Alps? Or an endless war against Rome? During these years, the Roman Republic faced one of its greatest internal challenges. But Rome had learned that this enemy was not to be underestimated. Soon, a man would appear who would end the rebellion with iron discipline and brutal severity: Marcus Licinius Crassus. Chapter 9. Marcus Crassus, the man who was supposed to save Rome. After the repeated defeats of the Roman consuls, the situation had become alarming for the Senate. Spartacus had shown that he was able to defeat not only improvised militias, but also regular legions. Italy was in turmoil, the rural population lived in fear, and Rome's authority was at stake. In this situation, the Senate turned to a man who was both rich and ambitious enough to tackle the problem with all his might: Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome, perhaps even the richest of his time. He had built up his fortune through clever business, real estate, and speculation, often at the expense of others. He was known for his greed, but also for his organizational talents. Politically, he strove for fame and influence, but so far he lacked a decisive military success to compete with men like Pompey or later Caesar. The fight against Spartacus was an opportunity for him to distinguish himself as the savior of Rome. When Crassus took command, he brought a new determination to Roman strategy. He received 8 legions, an enormous force, and he knew that only discipline and toughness could make the Romans capable of victory again. Crassus was notorious for his severity. Once he is said to have disciplined a mutinous unit with the cruelest of all punishments, decimation. 1 in 10 soldiers was beaten to death by their own comrades in order to make the others submissive through fear. This brutality had an effect. From then on, his legions obeyed him without hesitation. Crassus's strategy differed from that of his predecessors. Instead of relying on quick strikes, he relied on systematic encirclement. He did not only want to defeat Spartacus in individual battles, but to isolate and destroy him completely. To this end, he began to build a huge line of fortifications in the south of Italy, a ditch with a wall that was to close off the entire boot in order to enclose the rebels. For Spartacus, this was a new challenge. He had relied on agility and surprise, but now he was threatened with encirclement. Although he managed to break through again, Crassus did not let up. He pursued the rebels tirelessly, cut off their supply routes, and finally forced them into open battle, something Spartacus had long avoided. With Crassus, an opponent appeared who was equal to Spartacus, rich, ambitious, disciplined, and unscrupulous. The fight between the two was to become the decisive chapter of the uprising, a duel that decided between freedom and destruction. Chapter 10. The Last Battles, Spartacus' Desperate Resistance. When Marcus Licinius Crassus took command, the uprising had long since reached its peak. But the mood within the rebel army began to change. Spartacus had grown tired after years of fighting and wanted to end the war, perhaps by breaking out to the north or fleeing across the sea. But many of his companions were still filled with the certainty of victory or driven by a thirst for revenge. This inner conflict made the army more vulnerable, and Crassus was determined to exploit just that. The line of fortifications that Crassus had built in southern Italy was a masterpiece of Roman engineering. A deep trench, drawn over many kilometers, was supposed to enclose the rebels. Spartacus recognized the danger, but he was not prepared to give up without a fight. In a spectacular action, he had his men overcome part of the fortifications with torches and improvised bridges. Once again, the rebels managed to break out and move south, but the pressure grew and resources dwindled. In addition, the hope of fleeing across the sea was dashed. Spartacus is said to have tried to negotiate with pirates from Asia Minor who were to bring him and his people to Sicily. There, on the island, 2 great slave revolts had once taken place, and Spartacus hoped to find new allies. But the pirates betrayed him or broke their agreement. Instead of crossing, there was only new disappointment. More and more, the uprising became a desperate struggle for survival. Crassus moved in relentlessly, cutting off supply routes and forcing Spartacus into ever narrower spaces. Some groups of the rebels wanted to capitulate or desert. Others looted indiscriminately, which led to tensions among their own people. Spartacus himself tried to maintain order and keep his army together, but the situation became hopeless. In this situation, Spartacus showed his leadership for the last time. The sources report that in a great speech, he encouraged his men not to fall into captivity, but to fight for their freedom to the death. He himself refused to flee. Instead, he resolutely surrendered to the Roman army. The last battle took place in 71 BC in the region of Puglia. It was a desperate fight. Spartacus led his men into battle, no longer with the prospect of victory, but with the will not to fall alive into the hands of the Romans. Ancient reports describe that he pounced directly on Crassus's position, hoping to reach the Roman general and perhaps turn the tide in one fell swoop. But he fell, surrounded by enemies, fighting to the end. With his death, the resistance collapsed. The remnants of the rebel army were slaughtered or captured. Rome had won, but the price was high, and the memory of the revolt was to reverberate for a long time.
Chapter 11. The Cruel Victory of Rome. Crucifixions along the Appian Way. Spartacus's death in the final battle meant the end of the uprising, but Rome wanted more than just a military victory. The Senate and Marcus Licinius Crassus were determined to set an example that would nip future uprisings in the bud. For the memory of the years of humiliation by an army of slaves and gladiators could not go unpunished. After the defeat, tens of thousands of rebels were captured. Some sources speak of up to 60,000 who escaped the battles only to later fall into the hands of the Romans. There was no mercy for these men. Crassus opted for a punishment that was both cruel and symbolic: crucifixion. Along the Appian Way, the great road that led from Capua to Rome, he had about 6,000 survivors nailed to the cross. For many kilometers, the crosses stood in rows, each one a memorial to Rome's victory and the complete annihilation of the uprising. Those who walked down the street could not fail to notice the punishment that awaited those who dared to rise up against the order of the Republic. The crucifixions were not only an act of punishment, but also of psychological warfare. They were intended to spread fear among the slaves who perhaps dreamed of freedom, as well as among the Roman citizens who could question the authority of the Senate. The message was clear: Rome did not tolerate rebellion. But as much as Crassus consolidated his power, the victory remained ambivalent. Many Romans wondered why it could have come to this in the first place. How was it possible that an army of slaves had defeated the legions for years? The answer lay in the deep crisis of Roman society, which was based on slavery and social inequality. The uprising was crushed, but the causes remained. For Crassus himself, the victory over Spartacus meant an enormous gain in prestige, but he soon had to share this fame with a rival. Pompey, the great general, had returned from Spain with his army and had wiped out the last scattered groups of rebels. In Rome, he, like Crassus, claimed the glory for the end of the war. Thus, the victory over Spartacus became the starting point of a new rivalry that was to shape the political life of the Republic. The crosses on the Appian Way stood for a long time, silent witnesses of a cruel retribution. But as the bodies of the rebels decomposed, the memory of their leader began to grow. Spartacus was dead, but his name should not be forgotten, neither in Rome nor in history. Chapter 12. Aftermath. What the revolt revealed about Rome. The brutal suppression of the Spartacus uprising ended one of the greatest internal threats the Roman Republic had ever experienced. But as much as Rome celebrated its victory and used the cruelty of the crucifixions as a deterrent example, it could not suppress the fundamental questions that the revolt had raised. Spartacus was defeated, but the causes that had produced him remained. Rome's society in the 1st century BC was deeply divided. On the one side were the rich senators and large landowners who controlled vast estates and built their wealth on the labor of slaves. On the other side were the poor, free peasants who were impoverished by competition and debt, as well as the millions of slaves who eked out their lives without rights and without their rights. The uprising had clearly shown how explosive this gradient was. Rome reacted to the rebellion not with reforms, but with repression. There were no serious attempts to improve the conditions of slaves or reduce dependence on their labor. On the contrary, the Roman economy continued to be based on slave labor, and the games in the arenas continued unabated. Spartacus's uprising did not make the powerful rethink, but only strengthened their determination to brutally suppress any form of resistance. At the same time, the revolt revealed weaknesses in the Roman military and politics. The repeated defeats of the legions at the hands of an unconventional army of slaves came as a shock to the proud republic. They showed that the Roman army was not invincible, that complacency and underestimation could have fatal consequences. Only a man like Crassus, with iron discipline and unyielding severity, was able to avert the threat. Politically, the war strengthened the ambitions of the great generals. Crassus gained prestige. Pompey used the opportunity to present himself as a co-winner. Both were elected consuls, a result that further fueled rivalries within the elite. The victory over Spartacus was thus not only a military event, but also a turning point in the power struggles that were to shake the Republic in the decades that followed.
And yet, Spartacus was remembered, not as a criminal or an insurrectionary, as Rome wanted to portray him, but as a symbol. Even the ancient historians described him as an unusually clever, just, and brave man. For many, he was a hero who had dared to do the impossible, the fight for freedom against the greatest power of his time. The revolt thus betrayed Rome more than the senators would have liked. He showed that a system that disenfranchised millions of people was not sacrosanct. He revealed that arrogance and overconfidence made the republic vulnerable. And he left behind the idea that even in a world that gave slaves no voice, the dream of freedom could never be completely suffocated.
Chapter 13. Spartacus in the Memory of Antiquity. Although Spartacus's revolt had been crushed by Rome with extreme brutality, the memory of him could not be erased. Historians, philosophers, and chroniclers began to write about him as early as antiquity, sometimes with disgust, partly with respect. And so Spartacus occupied an unusual place in historiography as an enemy of Rome who at the same time aroused admiration. The most important ancient sources about the revolt come from Plutarch, Appian, and Florus. Plutarch, who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, describes Spartacus in his biography of Crassus as extraordinarily courageous and far-sighted. He emphasizes that Spartacus did not act like an ordinary barbarian, but like a real general. This recognition from the Roman point of view is remarkable, as enemies were otherwise often portrayed as savage, stupid, or cruel. Appian, a Greek historian, describes the uprising in his work on the Roman civil wars. He too emphasizes the military brilliance of Spartacus and the danger he posed to Rome. At the same time, he emphasizes how difficult it was to control an army of slaves that pursued different goals. For Appian, Spartacus was a man who almost achieved the impossible, to seriously shake Rome. Other authors were less benevolent. Florus, a Roman historian, speaks of Spartacus's army as a horde of criminals and slaves that threatened the state. This view was more in line with Rome's official line. Spartacus was to be regarded as a dangerous rebel, not a freedom fighter. But even in this pejorative portrayal, it remains noticeable that his uprising had an extraordinary dimension that could not simply be downplayed. Philosophers also took up Spartacus's story. Seneca, for example, used the figure of the slave as a symbol of inner freedom, a freedom that did not depend on external conditions. Although he did not mention Spartacus directly, the image of the slave who rises up against his fate remained alive in the thinking of antiquity. Roman politics, on the other hand, was largely silent about the revolt. It was not in the interest of the elites to remember a time when the Republic had been terrified by slaves. Official accounts focused on the victories of Rome, not the victories of Spartacus. Nevertheless, his name remained known, as a warning of the dangers of the slave masses, but also as a reminder of a man who had inflicted deep wounds on Roman pride. Thus, Spartacus existed in antiquity in an area of tension. For some, he was a barbarian and criminal, for others, a hero and general. It is precisely this contradiction that makes his figure so fascinating. For even Rome could not deny that Spartacus was more than just an escaped slave. He was an opponent who almost shook the foundations of the Republic. Chapter 14. Spartacus in the Middle Ages and the Early Modern Period. After the fall of the Roman Republic and the transition to the Empire, the memory of Spartacus gradually faded. Although his name was passed on in the writings of historians, in a world where slavery was still taken for granted, his rebellion remained more of a side note. In the Middle Ages, however, when the ancient texts were preserved in monasteries and later rediscovered in the Renaissance, Spartacus reappeared, albeit in a completely new interpretation. In the Christian Middle Ages, the idea of social revolution was not in the foreground, but the moral dimension of its history. Spartacus was considered by some chroniclers to be a warning example of the danger of turmoil and chaos. For in a world based on divine order, any rebellion was easily interpreted as an attack on the will of God. At the same time, however, there were also voices that saw in him a kind of martyr, one who rebelled against oppression, even when he failed. With the Renaissance, the view of Spartacus changed. The rediscovery of ancient texts led humanists such as Machiavelli or Guicciardini to reflect on the lessons of the uprising.
Machiavelli mentioned Spartacus in his writings as an example of how dangerous it is to oppress the masses without integrating them. For the political thinkers of the Renaissance, Spartacus was not a mere barbarian, but a figure who could be used to illustrate questions of power, order, and freedom. In the early modern period, Spartacus continued to gain symbolic power, especially in times of social tension. Peasants' uprisings, such as the Great German Peasants' War in the 16th century, were vaguely reminiscent of Spartacus's struggle in their force and their demand for freedom. Reformers and chroniclers drew parallels between the slaves of antiquity and the oppressed peasants of their own time. Although Spartacus was not always mentioned directly, the idea of a charismatic leader who rose up against an overpowering rule resonated here. Spartacus was also occasionally taken up in the political theory of the time. Philosophers who dealt with questions of freedom and domination used it as an example that even the most disenfranchised people are capable of standing up against oppression. In doing so, he slowly became a figure who was no longer considered just a troublemaker, but a symbol of a universal urge for freedom. In contrast to antiquity, where he was still regarded primarily as an enemy of Rome, Spartacus began a transformation in the Middle Ages and early modern times, from a marginal figure in Roman historiography to an archetype of the insurgent. Although his role in the Chronicles was often limited, the idea that he fought for freedom against oppression began to become more deeply engraved in cultural memory. The stage was set for the modern era, in which Spartacus was to become a leading figure of revolutionary movements, a symbol that went far beyond antiquity.
Chapter 15: Spartacus in the Modern Age, from the French Revolution to Marx. With the advent of modernity and the great political upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries, Spartacus took on a completely new meaning. While in antiquity it was mainly considered an enemy of Rome, and in the Middle Ages as a warning example of rebellion, it now became a symbol of freedom, equality, and resistance to oppression. The political movements of the time were looking for historical figures who gave expression to their ideals, and Spartacus seemed to be made for it. In the French Revolution, thinkers and orators took up his story to illustrate the struggle against tyranny and aristocracy. Spartacus appeared as a model of a man who freed himself from chains and challenged the powerful. For many revolutionaries, he was a symbol of the people's victory over the oppressors, even if his own uprising failed. His name no longer stood for chaos, but for the spirit of freedom. In the 19th century, Spartacus finally entered the ideological center of new political movements. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw in him the first proletarian who had stood up against a system of exploitation and class rule. Engels described Spartacus as the most wonderful guy in all ancient history, and saw in him the forerunner of modern class fighters. For Marxists, Spartacus was the archetype of a revolutionary, disenfranchised but full of awareness of injustice, courageous but without personal greed for power. Other thinkers also took up Spartacus's story. Poets, historians, and political writers saw him as a universal freedom fighter who stood up to an overpowering order. In Romanticism, the idea of the noble rebel who fights for a just cause and perishes himself in the process emerged. Spartacus became a projection screen for all those who turned against tyranny, be it against monarchs, colonial powers, or social injustice. The workers' movements of the 19th century adopted Spartacus as a leading figure. His name was sung about in poems, highlighted in articles, and invoked in political speeches. Workers' associations and socialist groups saw in him proof that the will for freedom flares up again and again in history, even under the harshest conditions. In this way, Spartacus transformed himself into a figure in modernity that reached far beyond antiquity. It became a symbol that gave strength to revolutionaries, workers, and oppressed alike. At a time when entire societies were in upheaval and the idea of freedom was taking on new forms, Spartacus offered the historical embodiment of a simple but powerful idea. The struggle for freedom is as old as humanity itself.
Chapter 16: Spartacus in the 20th Century: Revolution, Film, and Pop Culture. In the 20th century, the figure of Spartacus experienced an unprecedented rebirth. Hardly any other figure of antiquity was used so intensively for political movements, cultural currents, and artistic representations. The slave leader of the Roman Republic had long since become a universal symbol. And it was precisely in an era full of revolutions, wars, and ideological struggles that his name took on new meaning. The workers' movement played a central role in this. Socialist and communist groups took up Spartacus as a symbol of the class struggle. In Germany, after the First World War, the Spartacus League, a revolutionary organization led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was founded. Their goal was to bring the ideas of the Russian October Revolution to Germany and to establish the power of the working class. It was no coincidence that they called themselves the Spartacus League. They saw Spartacus as the ideal champion who stood for the liberation of the oppressed. Even though the movement failed and its leaders were brutally murdered, the name remained inextricably linked to the history of revolutionary socialism. Spartacus was also revered as a hero in the Soviet Union. Artists, writers, and historians celebrated him as the forerunner of the proletarian struggle. In films, plays, and monuments, he became a role model for the new man who stands up against exploitation. Spartacus thus became a part of the communist symbolic world, comparable to figures such as Prometheus or Garibaldi. But Spartacus became immortal not only in politics, but also in pop culture. Especially the Hollywood film Spartacus from 1960, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas, made him famous worldwide. The film portrayed Spartacus as a brave freedom fighter who had the courage to rebel against an overpowering order. The scene in which all the survivors shouted, "I am Spartacus," after his capture became legendary, an expression of solidarity and community that had an effect far beyond the film. The success of the film shaped the image of Spartacus for generations. He was no longer just a historical figure, but an archetype that was constantly reinterpreted in literature, art, and pop culture. Comics, novels, and even television series took up his story, sometimes historically, sometimes freely embellished. In all cases, however, Spartacus stood for the universal theme of resistance to oppression. At the same time, it remained a projection screen for political struggles. While socialists and communists saw it as a symbol of the class struggle, liberal movements also drew on it, understanding it as the embodiment of individual freedom. Spartacus was thus as changeable as the ideologies that used it. In the 20th century, Spartacus finally became more than a historical figure. He became a myth, a symbol, a global archetype. Whether in political speeches, in art, or in cinema, his name stood for courage, freedom, and the unwavering will not to be subjugated.
Chapter 17. Spartacus as a symbol of freedom, a timeless figure. Spartacus has long been more than just a figure in Roman history. His name has become synonymous with the urge for freedom that has accompanied humanity since time immemorial. From ancient historians to Renaissance philosophers to modernist revolutionaries, artists, and filmmakers, Spartacus has been reinterpreted again and again, adapted to the hopes and fears of the time. Why him? Why not one of the countless other rebels and oppressed who rebelled against their masters in history? The answer probably lies in the combination of extraordinary personality, dramatic history, and universal symbolism. Spartacus was no ordinary rebel, but a man who, from the lowest position, that of a slave, challenged the most powerful republic of his time. His courage and leadership made him a role model, his tragic end a legend. He offered a pattern for freedom movements around the world, the common man who rises up, not for personal power, but for the liberation of all. The fact that Spartacus failed does not diminish this myth, on the contrary. His downfall made him a martyr, a hero who fought for his cause to the end. In this respect, he is similar to other historical figures such as Che Guevara or Joan of Arc, whose failure only increased their radiance. His image is surprisingly changeable. For Marxists, he was the first revolutionary of the working class. For liberals, a symbol of individual freedom. For Christians, an example of sacrifice. For artists, an inexhaustible source of drama. This complexity explains why Spartacus has been taken up again and again, whether in political speeches, in literature, or in films. At the same time, his story touches on a universal human feeling, the longing for freedom. Slavery and oppression are among the darkest chapters in human history.
Spartacus's uprising is a reminder that even in the most seemingly hopeless situations, the desire for freedom cannot be extinguished. It shows that even the disenfranchised have a voice, and that this voice, if it gets loud enough, makes even the powerful tremble. So Spartacus remains a timeless figure. Its history may date back 2,000 years, but its message is still relevant today. It tells us that freedom is never given, but must be fought for, and that even the greatest oppressor cannot be safe if the oppressed decide to rise up. Chapter 18. The Spartacus Uprising in the Mirror of the Present. Although the Spartacus Uprising took place over 2,000 years ago, it continues to have an impact today. Hardly any other event in antiquity is so often referred to when it comes to discussing questions of freedom, oppression, and resistance. Spartacus's history is not only a chapter of Roman history, but a mirror in which the present is constantly reconsidered. In a world still marked by social inequalities, the uprising is a reminder that oppression is never absolute. Even where people are disenfranchised, exploited, or silenced, resistance can form. Spartacus is therefore often mentioned in discussions about human rights, social justice, or political oppression. His character warns, there is no rule that remains untouched forever. Spartacus also plays a role in the culture of remembrance. Movements that fight against modern forms of slavery, such as human trafficking or forced labor, occasionally invoke him as a symbol. It reminds us that slavery is not a relic of antiquity, but still exists today. Spartacus' name thus becomes a memorial against one of the oldest and cruelest institutions in human history. Spartacus is still quoted in politics today, especially where the oppressed rise up against overpowering structures. Whether in liberation movements, protest movements, or in artistic representations, his uprising is symbolic of the courage to dare the impossible. The slogan, "I am Spartacus," from the famous film, is still used today as an expression of solidarity, whether at demonstrations or in social networks. Spartacus also has its place in research. Historians ask what his revolt reveals about Roman society, about its dependence on slavery, about the brutality of its order, about the limits of its power. Archaeologists are looking for traces of the battles, literary scholars are analyzing the narratives of antiquity, and political scientists are drawing parallels between Spartacus and modern revolutionaries. For the general public, Spartacus remains an archetype, the rebel, the martyr, the freedom fighter. His myth inspires not only political movements, but also art and pop culture. Series, novels, and films take up his story again and again, sometimes historically, sometimes freely interpreted. In all variants, the core message remains: Spartacus stands for the dream of freedom and the power of resistance. In this way, the Spartacus uprising lives on in the present, not as a past event, but as a symbol. He reminds us that history is not only written by victors, but also by those who fought for their freedom and perished in the process. And it shows that their legacy is often stronger than the victory of their opponents. Chapter 19. Conclusion: Spartacus and the Eternal Longing for Freedom. The history of the Spartacus uprising is more than just a chapter of Roman history. It is a symbol that points far beyond its time. Spartacus was not an emperor, not a statesman, not a general by birth, but a man who stood at the bottom of society, a slave, a gladiator. And yet he succeeded in shaking the most powerful republic of antiquity for years. His uprisings show that even the most disenfranchised are not powerless. A small group of escaped gladiators grew into a movement that defeated legions and terrified cities. Spartacus proved that courage, organization, and the will to freedom can unleash forces that can shake even an empire. But his story is also that of failure. In the end, Spartacus succumbed to the sheer power of Rome, the internal divisions of his movement, and the relentless resources of his opponent. The crucifixions along the Appian Way made it clear that Rome would not tolerate any uprising. The dream of freedom for hundreds of thousands ended cruelly on the cross. And yet, Spartacus has not been forgotten. His name became the epitome of the struggle for freedom, his story an inspiration for generations of the oppressed. He was interpreted as a forerunner of the class struggle, as a martyr, as a symbol of solidarity. Each epoch has rediscovered it for itself, as a mirror of its own longing for freedom. Spartacus's legacy lies not in territorial conquest or political reform, but in the power of his example. He embodies the eternal truth that people strive for freedom, even when the odds are against them. The fact that this struggle can fail does not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it gives it tragedy and dignity. So Spartacus remains a timeless hero. His revolt tells us not only of the Roman Republic and its dependence on slaves, but also of humanity in the midst of cruelty. He reminds us that freedom can never be taken for granted, but must be fought for, and that there will always be people who are willing to risk their lives for this dream. Spartacus died on the battlefield. His body was lost, but his name lives on. It has become a myth, a legend that radiates far beyond the walls of Rome. His legacy is humanity's eternal longing for freedom, a legacy that will never be extinguished.